Thank you for coming today. My name is Rachel Zoll. I'm the National Religion Reporter with the Associated Press. We're here today to talk about America's changing religious landscape. The United States has always had a pretty dynamic religious life because of our freedom of belief and also our immigrant makeup. But in the last several years, we've undergone some changes that have seemed especially significant. For the first time, we are no longer have a Protestant majority in this country. A few years ago, the percentage and the share of Protestants dipped below 50% definitively for the first time. More Americans now are leaving organized religion altogether, and there's evidence that many of them are actually never coming back. We're still a very religious country, especially when you compare us to the nations of Western Europe. In fact, the number of evangelicals has actually increased over the last several years, and by many measures, evangelicals are actually as committed as they were before to religious life, if not more so. These are all findings from the Pew Research Center and a very important report that they did called America's Changing Religious Landscape. It's a study that's based on a survey of thousands of people over a span of years, and it's going to be the the core of what we're going to be talking about today. Why are these trends important? Well, they help shape how we live, how we vote, what public policies we support, and really whether or not we can all get along. We have 3 senators here to tackle that question. I'm going to start by introducing Senator Kaine. Senator Kaine is a Democrat from Virginia. He sits on the Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Budget, and Aging committees, and he's co-chair of the Senate Prayer Breakfast. When he was in law school, he took a year off to serve with Jesuit missionaries in Honduras. He worked at a technical school teaching carpentry and welding skills. He entered political life in 1994 and served as a city councilman, a mayor, a lieutenant governor, and a governor. He attends St. Elizabeth Catholic Church in Richmond. Next, we have Senator Coons. Senator Coons is a Democrat from Delaware. He is a member of the Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health Policy. He traveled to Africa in the late 1980s to work with the South African Council of Churches in the anti-apartheid movement, and while there, he preached in Archbishop Desmond Tutu's church. Chris has a master's degree in ethics from Yale Divinity School, and he's a member of First and Central Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, and continues to preach regularly at houses of worship across Delaware. And next we have Senator Lankford. Senator Lankford is a Republican from Oklahoma with a long record of service also with Baptists in his state. He was elected to finish the term of retiring Senator Tom Coburn. From 1995 to 2009, he served as Director of Student Ministry at the Baptist Convention of Oklahoma and Director of the Falls Creek Youth Camp. That camp is considered the largest youth camp in the country. It has more than 51,000 people attending each summer. James and his wife Cindy have been married for over 20 years and have 2 daughters. To explain a little bit more about the report itself that is the basis of our discussion today, Alan Cooperman from the Pew Research Center is here. Alan is the Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center. He's an expert on the role of religion in U.S. politics and has reported on religion in Russia, the Middle East, and Europe. Before joining Pew, he was a national reporter and editor at the Washington Post, and most importantly, I think, a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press. So, Alan, if you'd like to start.
Thank you very much. One thing that's changing is, with the senator's help, I learned to push a button, and now maybe you can hear what I'm saying. But I thank you again. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, the senators, for organizing this. The Pew Research Center has conducted 2 very large, nationally representative surveys. The first was in 2007. The second was in 2014. Both had more than 35,000 respondents reached by random digit dialing on landlines and cell phones all across the United States. And when we take these 2 twin surveys and we look at them 7 years apart, we can see, I think, many things, including a few important big picture trends. Now, the first of those big picture trends that I would call to your attention is that the U.S. public as a whole has, in recent years, become a little bit less religious. So the percentage of Americans who say they believe in God, while still very high, has dipped a little bit. The percentage of Americans who say they regularly attend religious services has dropped a little bit. The percentage of Americans who say they pray daily has dropped a little bit, and so on. Perhaps most strikingly, the share of American adults who today do not identify with any particular religion, who call themselves atheists, agnostics, or say their religion is nothing in particular, is higher than it has been, as far as we know, ever in the United States, but certainly has risen in recent years, okay? So it's now about 23% of the US public. In 2007, it was 16%. And among young US adults between the ages of 18 and 30, fully 36% are what is sometimes called religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Now, when you think about religious nuns, you should not imagine people who are entirely devoid of any religious or spiritual beliefs. In fact, a majority of the nuns tell us they believe in God, and many of the nuns do have other beliefs or practices. But you also should not imagine a group that is highly spiritual, just not religious, just not connected with organized religion. In fact, the nuns as a whole are both less religious and less spiritual by all the kind of generic markers of spirituality that we have than are those Americans who identify with a religious group. Now, at the same time that the United States is becoming a little bit less religious and that the share of the nuns is rising quite rapidly, we should realize, as Rachel said, that the United States, by comparison with other advanced industrial countries, remains very highly religious. 3/4, roughly speaking, of Americans are still religiously affiliated. They do claim some faith, and furthermore, in our surveys, we see that people who claim a religious faith, people who are religiously affiliated, are just overall as observant, as religiously committed as they were 7 years ago. And in fact, on a few measures, such as how frequently they read scriptures and how often they share their faith and how often they engage in small religious groups such as Bible study groups or prayer groups, they're actually slightly higher than they were 7 years ago among the religiously affiliated. So, just to quickly sum up, to try to put this into figures that you can get your heads around, what has happened in the United States isn't so much that the number of highly religious Americans has declined. It hasn't. In fact, when we multiply our figures to try to calculate how many Americans are highly religious, the number in 2014 is about the same as it was in 2007. But the number of Americans who are not particularly religious, that has risen. And it has risen particularly among younger Americans, because the millennial generation, young American adults, are coming of age not only less religious and less religiously connected than previous recent generations, but they are far less religious and less religiously connected than those previous generations ever were, even when those generations were young. That's a very quick synopsis of some of the key findings of our survey, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the senators what they think about this, what they think are the implications. There are obviously no right and wrong answers from this, and you all, of course, know that the Pew Research Center is a non-advocacy organization, and we do not promote religion or non-religion or take any policy stance of any sort. So again, thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you, senators, for the opportunity for this good conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. I wanted to start, if we could ask each one of the senators to talk a little bit about why this issue is important to you and a little bit about your own religious experiences, which are also interesting. If we could start with Senator Kaine.
Rachel did a good job of telling you about me. So I grew up in a very Irish Catholic family, but the religion of your parents, does not just automatically become yours. You go through a time of searching, and then you have to make it your own. It's never just the faith of the fathers. You've got to make it your own. And so I sort of drifted away from organized religion for a bit in college, but then I guess I felt this still small voice when I was in law school and decided to take a year off and then go work with missionaries in Honduras. And that reconnected me not only to my Catholicism, but also to the need for worship in groups rather than just being a solitary reader of spiritual literature. The other people are what help you figure things out and advance you along the way through their example, good or bad, through their corrective advice. And so I came back from my time in Honduras wanting to worship in places that were like the little parish that I worshipped at, Las Mercedes in El Progreso, Honduras. And it's been a very important part of my life. I think those of us in politics, I mean, I'll give a Democratic stereotype. So one stereotype would be, well, let's take it out of the partisan. One stereotype would be I'm a religious person and my job is to enact my religious beliefs on all others. That's one pole. There's another pole that says I'm a religious person, but I'm just supposed to keep that out of the public sphere completely. Those are two poles. I've struggled in 22 years in public life for sort of how to be a religious person in the world that I'm in. And what I've decided is I should just be authentically who I am, and much like I would share that I'm interested in the Kansas City Chiefs or love baseball and camping, if I would share that, or if I would share that I'm married and have 3 children, why wouldn't I share the most important thing about me? Not to make anybody else be like me, but just to let folks know what matters to me. And so I've always found it pretty easy to just describe my own faith background and the worship and my religious beliefs now as a way of just kind of letting folks know who I am. And in doing that, then other folks share with me who they are. And I've always felt like, you know, my general counsel when I was governor was a very devoutly religious Jew who's a close friend. And his being a good Jew always made me a better Catholic. And I hope that me being a better Catholic made him a better Jew. So if we share with each other, we can all help ourselves improve. And that's kind of the way I've tried to bring my own ongoing faith, journey to everyday life in politics.
Great, thanks. Senator.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Alan, and thanks for both your study and for bringing us together. I'm thrilled to be with my friends, James and Tim, and to have a chance to visit with you about some of the most important commitments and relationships we have as elected officials and as people of faith. I'll just pick up a little bit where Tim was headed there. First, in my own family and in my own youth and faith formation experience, we were sort of a faith in action family. I'm Presbyterian. I was raised in a suburban, overwhelmingly white, fairly moderate to Republican congregation, but with a preacher who challenged us regularly and who pushed us to do more and be more and to be more engaged. And so my parents, at different times when I was growing up, would take us to volunteer at a homeless shelter or go to the state prison and visit with prisoners or take in an immigrant family, and they didn't talk about it much, they just did it. They would not describe themselves as deeply religious people. They would say they were just trying to do what you're supposed to do. So not a lot of public religiosity. I don't think they would describe themselves as devout, but if you look at how they actually raised us, my dad taught Sunday school, my mom played the guitar, they were active in worship weekly. We prayed over dinner every single day. We prayed as a family regularly. We did things that they would have said if I asked, well, we're doing this because God loves us, and so we're called to show God's love to others, and we're called to show that our neighbor includes people we've never met, but who are in prison or who are homeless or who are hungry or who are sick. And I think that laid a very strong foundation for me. Like Tim, like I think everybody, I went through a period as a young adult sort of questioning whether this was my faith or their faith. And it was, as Rachel mentioned, most powerfully time spent in Kenya and South Africa, in particular in the apartheid struggle in South Africa, where I saw people of faith stepping up and taking huge risks and being able to put themselves on the line for social change. And it was only in that context that I began to learn my own country's history and to really get a deeper sense of what a central role the church, all different aspects of the faith community of the United States, has played in everything from literally the civil rights movement and the labor rights movement to the Revolutionary War that was the foundation of our independence. So I became interested. I only went to divinity school sort of later in life as a component of also being at law school. And I do think that we have a challenge as elected officials to do, as Tim said, to share with people authentically who we are and what moves us and what sustains us, and to not hide our faith from those who hire us, but to also speak and act in ways that respect the fact that many of our constituents are people of different faiths or of no faith. And so in sharing about what motivates us and in witnessing through our actions, to also not shut out or marginalize or make less valued those whose faith traditions are quite different from ours, or that increasing number, as you mentioned, Alan, that increasing number of younger Americans who don't have a faith frame of reference. That is challenging at times. I think it is harder for us to hear each other and to know each other and respect each other because of that increasingly attenuated shared faith background and context. But I'm enormously encouraged that literally the most popular person on earth right now is Pope Francis, and that a young generation is growing up with aspirational leaders who help show faith in action.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for putting this together. It's a great dialogue to have. And quite frankly, it's one of the dialogues that all of us long for. For whatever reason, the nation is becoming more and more either uncomfortable with faith or in some places afraid of faith. To where those that have faith, it's fine to have faith as long as you practice it over there. I don't want to see it or hear about it. Instead of being an open conversation nationally, assuming people have faith and some people don't have faith, they're not less of American because they don't have faith, but you're also not less of American because you not only have a faith, but you live your faith. I tell people all the time that faith is faith when it permeates every part of who you are. If your faith only matters to you on weekends, that's really not a faith, that's a hobby. And you can have a hobby, that's okay, but if it's a faith, it affects how I treat my wife, it affects how we treat each other, it affects how I drive, it affects how I interact with other people. It shouldn't be something that I hide because I was elected. It should be just a part of who I am, and that people know that's a part of who I am, and that's okay. To have that perspective. Because someone has a different faith than me doesn't intimidate me. Just because someone I talk to disagrees with my faith, that doesn't challenge my faith, except it drives me to look harder at my own faith to be able to evaluate it. I accepted Christ when I was 8 years old. I was a skinny little redheaded kid sitting in the balcony in church and actually listened for once, and couldn't stop thinking about the fact that there is a God and I don't know him. And I just continued thinking about that. And I was at home at night that evening in my own bed and prayed and accepted Jesus Christ and asked him to forgive my sins. That was the beginning point for me of a faith journey that still continues today. Now in high school, did I walk my faith consistently? No. It was later in high school that I remember making a decision to say, God, this is either real or it's not. To come to the point of deciding, I'm either going to follow you or I'm going to walk away. And my own personal search of the scriptures really led me to go back and say, no, this is real. And I'm going to try to live these principles. Now, those principles still continue for me today. For 22 years, I served in ministry. I served working with middle school, high school, and college-age students. I'm a little bit of a different duck in that I not only have a background of 22 years of ministry, but like Chris here, I have a master's degree in divinity and in theology. And for me, my passion is still studying Scripture and trying to live out those basic principles. That doesn't keep me from also hopefully being a very good legislator as well, and be able to work for all kinds of issues. But that's the lens I look through. Everyone has a lens that they look through. But I acknowledge that my lens is I believe that there is a God and that he loves his creation, and that affects how I treat other people. And while there are times there's a push and pull, of people saying you're an elected official, you've got to take your faith off, I like to smile at them and say you should read the whole Constitution. Because Article 6 of the Constitution says there's no religious test for any officer of the United States. Any person that's elected doesn't have to be a certain denomination or religion, or doesn't have to take that faith off. You can be who you choose to be. It's the joy of being an American where we have the protected free exercise of religion, not just the freedom of worship. We have the ability to not only have a faith, but to be able to live that faith. And what I would hope to do is push back on a national dialogue again and to say, why don't we respect each other enough that people that choose to not have faith can live that way, but people that choose to have faith can also live out their faith as well. And I think it's a healthy part of our environment.
Thank you. You've talked about working across faith lines, and you all work across political party lines. I wanted to ask you about one of the most difficult pressing issues right now in the news, and that's the issue of religious freedom. We're seeing so many conflicts erupt over religious freedom and requests for exemptions from recognizing same-sex marriage in a clash with civil rights for LGBT folks. Is it possible to find a common ground there? Is it possible to find a compromise? If so, who should be doing the compromising?
I think so. We're going to have to feel our way to it, and I think, part of what we have to grapple with is the difference between the public sphere and the private individual sphere. The equality principle in the 14th Amendment is pretty blunt, and it's funny that we look at our history. Those who wrote in the Declaration of Independence, who basically all got on board in 1776 and said, "We believe all are created equal," they didn't see a contradiction between saying equality and slavery. They didn't see it. 80 years later, they saw it. We fought a war. They changed the Constitution to say, we mean equality. When they said that, they didn't see a contradiction between ending slavery, but still meaning women couldn't vote. That took another 80 years. And then, oh, wait a minute, we said equal. We got to let women vote. And then it was another 30 years before, oh, wow, we said equality. We got to let kids go to school regardless of the different skin colors. We have a moral North Star for our public life that we've reaffirmed again and again and again, the equality principle. And we kind of wake up and realize what it means, and we kind of adjust our attitudes about that in terms of who we are as a nation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people can't, feel free. My church makes a decision about what marriages they will celebrate in the sanctuary of a Catholic church and what they won't. That's a decision that they make, but they don't go down and try to keep the clerk from issuing a certificate to people for a marriage that's not going to be performed in a Catholic church. So some of what we'll work our way to is an understanding that equality means equality in a nation that, it was interesting, Jefferson, forgive me for being a Jefferson guy, or a statute of religious freedom guy. The original First Amendment was a Virginia statute before it was put in the First Amendment. But when you put the equality principle front and center, and he said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, there were other truths. Then Lincoln at Gettysburg said we're a nation dedicated to the proposition. Lincoln cut off the other truths and just said we're dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. And so we've had this North Star before us. We're imperfect, so we'll never get to the North Star, but we continually kind of reorient our thinking about who we are as a nation toward that moral foundational principle, which is so inspirational. But there is room for some give between the commands of civil society and what the rights of all that we must respect and private ability to have opinions or private institutions to set rules that don't deny people civil equality, but can have their own rules with respect to their own institutions.
Religious liberty and the correct understanding of the boundaries between free exercise, individual liberty, and how we engage with each other in civil societies. One of the longest and deepest arguments we have as a country. First, I'm proud to be an American and part of a society that has the argument. And where instead of shooting each other over it, as is currently happening in a dozen nations, we have a debate and a discussion about it. And we have different places and times where we can shape and form that debate and that reflection. I'll pick up on the topic of marriage that you raised. We've had a 20, 30-year debate as a country. Many religious denominations have strongly held views about the nature of marriage and its origin. Some denominations, including mine, have changed their view. I was raised in a church that did not recognize marriage as anything other than one man, one woman. My denomination now celebrates same-sex marriages. And that was a very difficult, challenging, long conversation within one of the mainline Protestant denominations. We have states that sort of went one direction. We have states that had a very different direction. Marriage is both a religious institution, a sacrament, and a civil institution, but that has profound consequences for everything from pensions to burial to taxes to health care. My own journey on this was in part occasioned by understanding the impact of all those different federal things, access to health care, access to when bereaved over the loss of a lifetime partner, the ability to visit them in the ICU. And so what I initially conceived of as a solely religious institution, I began to understand over many years the impact on the liberty and the ability to enjoy their sort of created capacity for love of a wide range of my fellow Delawareans and Americans. The debate we're having today mostly focuses on whether compelling a civil servant to do their job impinges on their individual free exercise. On that ground, I think I'm going to weigh towards the liberty of individuals in civil society. But there are other decisions that have been made by our government more recently that impinge on the ability of religious institutions and how they treat their employees and how they practice, where I think we don't yet have it right. We've got a very tough conversation to have about this. My hunch is it may come up in the election, and my hunch is that we're not yet done. But as long as we can continue to lift up the importance of individual religious free exercise, and that it deserves an equal footing with a civil society where we respect individual liberty, we're at least asking the right questions. And as long as we continue to have institutions as diverse as the Supreme Court, elections, and religious institutions and organizations, we'll continue to have a range of opportunities for people to explore what our differing faiths mean.
So let me throw something at it's an observation that I picked up based on your question. Because I've seen it over the last 2 years. People will say you're either for religious liberty or you're for gay marriage. Or they'll say if you support religious liberty, then you're anti-gay. And they want to take that and just pull that apart. And that is factually not who we are, nor where we have been as a nation. And I think that is a very precarious road of constricting speech when you immediately put someone in a box and say, well, if you support religious liberty, that means you're anti-gay. If we connect the dots on those two, I think we silence a whole group of people that are people of faith, and we stop a conversation that needs to happen nationally. And I think that's a bigger issue than we know. It is not uncommon for me to speak to a group of college students in my state, and in the course of the conversation, this same issue comes up, worded almost exactly as you did. And it really tries to put the two. You can either be for one or the other. And that's just not true of who we are. Now, this is a big issue that we've got to deal with as a nation, but it's always been a big issue. It just continues to grow for us. My state of Oklahoma, we've had organizations like Hobby Lobby. If I say Hobby Lobby to you, if you're in the political sphere, you think about Hobby Lobby and Supreme Court. If it was 4 years ago, you thought of craft store. And it's a very different thing. But Hobby Lobby literally started in the garage of the Green family making picture frames and is a closely held, family-owned business that has grown extremely fast and extremely large, but it's still the same family that still runs the business the way they choose to. Close on Sundays, close early on Wednesdays. They play Christian music in their stores. They still function the same way they always have, but they're this fantastic store that's grown dramatically across the country. They suddenly had a religious liberty issue that they had to decide what they felt like they were being compelled to help provide insurance for something that they felt would provide abortion. They had to determine, are we going to close the stores, or are we going to try to fight this all the way, or sell the stores, or what are we going to do? Because for them, it was a religious faith issue. And I heard all kinds of people talk about it's a politic issue, but I know the family. The family's not a political family. They don't like being in public. They're very quiet, and they're very personal. This was a deeply held religious belief for them that they suddenly had to argue all the way to the Supreme Court, can we live our faith in our business? And in that particular question was, is there a certain size of business, if you grow to a business this large, you can no longer live your faith? If you're a smaller company, you can. If you're a larger company, you cannot, even if it's a closely held company that's still owned by the family. Those are big issues to determine as Americans. Is there some point where you're so public as a private institution that suddenly you can't practice your faith anymore? It's the same thing our universities are dealing with right now. There's a movement that has occurred with the Department of Education where they've posted for the first time ever out on a website making available every Christian institution that has asked for an exemption under religious grounds. And they put it out on the website. Well, that is an interesting decision to make. They say it's for transparency, But there's a whole set of groups that now say we want to now expose those Christian institutions as these are bigoted institutions that are closed-minded, and here are the institutions that are at risk. There are individuals and groups that are practicing their faith. They're not a target of enemies. They're a place of faith. This is part of what we've got to do to be able to function together as a society, to be able to honor each other as persons. And what I reiterate over and over again, a person that's created in the image of God and has value and worth, regardless of your beliefs, that is a person of value and worth, even when we disagree. But to allow people to be able to disagree on some of these issues, but people of faith to still be able to live their faith, especially in a faith-based institution or in a business that started under faith principles.
Those are great answers and actually a great sort of overview of the debate itself, just the different positions that the senators are taking. We wanted to give people a chance to actually ask questions themselves. I think, is that right? So if anyone had a question for any of the senators, you want to raise your hand, we'll take questions. If not, I will ask the next question. Go ahead.
So the Mormon Church had a long policy of discriminating against African Americans based on their faith principles. And there was considerable public pressure for decades for them to end that in order to see government funding for the foundation, things like that. And they did eventually change their policies. So what allows, or what is the difference between religious liberty and discrimination against LGBT and the kind of religious liberty that Mormons claimed for decades against African Americans?
What year was that ended? Up until the 70s. Well, obviously, the civil rights movement had a tremendous impact nationally of America. As Tim was mentioning earlier, as Americans have gone through different awakenings on this, there are some uniquenesses when you deal with marriage. Marriage is one of those things for a Christian and for other denominations and other religions as well. There's a clear religious teaching there about marriage. Whether it be from Genesis 1 all the way into Romans 1 and over again, this affirmation of what marriage is and how it's to be recognized and how it's seen. So it's not a tangential teaching for Christian denominations and Christian faith. It's been a core belief from the beginning. And so then the challenge is, as Chris had mentioned as well, some denominations are reevaluating that with their denomination based on where things are in culture and what's occurring. Those are decisions every denomination, every group can make.
It was a core tenet of Mormon teaching that those of dark skin
Right.
were lesser. So I'm just asking if they have continued that and they wanted to refuse to acknowledge accommodation, would that religious liberty argument be valid to you?
So I'm a little bit of a disadvantage here that I don't know that particular area. I don't track Mormonism that much, not anything on Mormons. I've served with several, by the way, here in the Senate. But I don't know that particular teaching or the history of it. I know clearly the church doesn't teach that anymore. That's not a church teaching now, as well as polygamy and other things that are historic within the Mormon faith. But there is a uniqueness in every faith and how they actually choose to live their faith out. And to recognize an individual, to say this is a person of faith that's holding a deeply held religious belief, we have had a sense within a nation that we're going to do whatever we can to be able to accommodate that and to have the least amount of government intrusion into individuals being able to live out their faith. And so to say to Hobby Lobby owners, for instance, you have to practice your business now in a new way. We've now passed a new law, and you're going to have to shift your business to a new way that violates your biblical teachings and your belief is a shift from where we've been as a nation. We've not had a time where we would say, you have a certain faith, I have a different faith as a government, you're going to have to change to our practice or I'll close down your business.
Oh, any other questions? Go ahead.
This is a question for the entire panel. So at the beginning, you were talking about the growth of the religiously unaffiliated, how it's concentrated primarily in the younger Americans, but it's also something that's seen across the board. And I was just wondering, what attempts has there been to talk to this group of individuals identifying as none, because it is a growing segment of society, not just those
I think that's a great question for all of us, and in some ways the question going forward. So last year I went and attended the Secular Summit, the Secular Coalition of America's annual summit of all the atheist and non-theist group. And I was about to say I had a great experience. And I pushed myself to do that in no small part to engage with this exact question. And as I think my comments at the Secular Summit last year reflected, we have a slightly greater challenge in organizing ourselves as a society around social justice causes and purposes when you don't have access to a shared language and value set that is rooted in a particular text, a particular tradition, a particular shared faith. But I don't think it should be in any way viewed as sort of insurmountable or some huge challenge because first, as you heard in the Pew study, the number of non-Judeo-Christian faiths in the United States is also growing significantly. So if you take the folks who are of faiths that have a different scriptural background or values background and those who don't share a faith background, I am convinced that overwhelmingly they share a values background of an interest in promoting positive neighborhoods, strong families, an equitable society, equal justice before the law. There are secular values in how the United States conducts itself in our political life and in our public life that I think can be every bit as strong in moving us forward collectively as the values that I identify as coming from my religious experience and from my religious faith. It's a little bit harder. It takes a little bit more work. You have to overcome what I see as the rapidly growing, and this is from my perspective, forgive me, I was going to say religious illiteracy that presumes a certain foundational text as the only text. But when you don't have a shared frame of reference, I just think it is harder for us to have conversations that move us forward. But we can't abandon that project. Atheists have been an important and contributing part of American civil society since its founding. And my participation in this was started when a friend said to me, which of these types of president will be the last elected? You know, an African-American president, a woman president, a gay president, or an atheist president? And I didn't have long to reflect, and he said, it's an atheist president. That is the repeatedly identified last likely group to be represented in the White House. I had never thought about that before a couple years ago. He's now gotten that thought into my head. I do think I have an obligation as an elected official to speak and act in ways that engage and mobilize those who have a non-theist or a humanist worldview, but who are still willing, ready, and able to be great citizens and great contributors and part of our civil society. It's going to be a little bit harder. It's not quite the same foundation that I was working from as a younger man, but I think as long as we continue to emphasize empathy, which is a fundamental human value, and a commitment to progress and to social justice, there's no reason this isn't an exciting new chapter in American civil society.
I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jason Sarm with the Hindu American Foundation. The Department of Justice, I think last year, at the beginning of last year, enacted or implemented anti-Hindu, anti-Sikh, and anti-Arab hate crime categories as a result of the growing xenophobia. In your states and in this body politic of the Senate or Congress, how are you combating xenophobia towards fairly newer immigrant communities that may carry a religious tradition that is different from the larger body of the United States? Because it is something that we are dealing with on a daily basis, whether it be in our schools, textbooks, nationally, in the rhetoric that happens at local communities, and in the media as a whole.
Can I tell a story about why this is such an important question? And then the question will be answered by the two guys with the divinity degrees. So I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee. And in January, a bunch of us were in Israel and Turkey back to back. And on sort of successive days, we had interaction with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other leaders in Israel, and then President Erdogan and other leaders in Turkey. And the questions to us were almost identical in these two very, very different societies, from leaders that were, a Jewish prime minister, Muslim president. What's going on in your presidential race? And then we said, well, what do you mean by that? And what's with all the anti-Muslim stuff? Now, you might have expected to have heard that in Turkey, right? But it wasn't necessarily the message that I thought I would have heard from Israeli leaders. But when we inquired further, so, okay, why are you asking us this? They described it almost exactly the same way. We live in a part of the world that is deeply, painfully, bleedingly sectarian. We don't always want to be like that. We want our part of the world to be a place where people can live in the same neighborhood, work in the same place, go to the same schools with different faith backgrounds, but get along and make it work. For us to get there, we've got to have an example. And you've been our example. You are our example. So our ability to respect all traditions is important for us, existentially important for us. It's in the First Amendment for a reason, but it's not just important for us. It's also important because we have been able to uniquely kind of make it work. Not that we're perfect at anything, but we've been able to make it work so that other societies that want to be more like that have a society that they can shoot for. So that's why speaking out against xenophobia and truly respecting the radical notion of a First Amendment. I mean, Jefferson basically said, you know, you shouldn't be preferred or punished based on how you worship or not. And it was one of only two original ideas in the American Constitution, that and that the Congress should declare war rather than the king, executive, emperor, sultan, monarch. Those are the only two ideas that are original in our Constitution. We've given it to the world. It's a great gift to the world that we've given, and we can't squander it without turning our back on our fundamental principle. And so that's why it's really important that we figure this out and figure out a way to clearly show that putting people down because of how they choose to worship or not is just, that's not who we are.
How a society behaves when it's under stress and scared is how you best show your core values and your principles. And in times of war and in times of national perceived insecurity, we have had an unfortunate history of isolating or excluding or marginalizing based on religious or racial identity. I think how we respond to refugees from current conflict in the Middle East, and whether or not we isolate them solely based on their religion, and whether we are still a welcoming country to those who are refugees from conflict, is particularly important to how we show the world our continuing values as a country. I was on that same trip with Tim and heard similar concerns and conversations. Your question also was, what do we do? From my early public service at the county level, I became aware that I was representing a workforce that perhaps wasn't broadly exposed to the whole range of my community, as I wasn't at that point. And so partly I just started by example, trying to make it clear that I was regularly going to services and to go to mosques, to go to synagogues, to go to the Hindu temple. We now have a Sikh Gujarat, and to employ people on my staff here in Washington as a senator who are from a wide range of faith traditions, and to speak openly and publicly about their role in my home state and in my community, so that there isn't this sense of non-participation or isolation. I also think we have, as Tim says, an obligation to demonstrate by how we legislate and how we speak at the national level as well as at the local level. I am concerned about the lack of religious literacy in the United States, about the misunderstandings and misperceptions about what different faith traditions teach and what their values are. I'm struck at how often I have very pointed and difficult conversations with constituents who are convinced that Islam is a religion of violence and hatred, and aren't familiar at all with the gap between the core religious teachings and the practices of the vast majority of Muslims and the distinguishable actions of a radical, violent minority that may claim affiliation with Islam, but in no way reflects its values and traditions. So I worry long-term about our ability to continue to be this nation that shows to the world what genuine religious pluralism lived together in relative harmony can look like. And I think if we have a greater number of younger Americans who have no religious identity or affiliation, that's fine. But I worry that that's only sustainable if they're also informed about the practices of a wide range of American backgrounds.
So it is a great dialogue to be able to have. and it's one that I think all of us have at different points. It's not uncommon from my state of Oklahoma that I'll have someone that'll pull me aside at the end of a town hall meeting or during a town hall meeting, and we'll talk about Hinduism and we'll talk about Muslims. Obviously, because of the rise of terrorism worldwide, Muslims come up first in that conversation very often, and they want to know what happens. While we're talking about, I think the number is somewhere around 1% of the country are followers of Islam. That is a very frequent conversation in areas where that actually rises up. So I have two responsibilities. One is to be able to say that we do have freedom of worship and we have freedom of religion. That is the free exercise of religion. You can practice your faith and have a faith or have no faith at all, and to reinforce that in that situation. The other thing that comes up for me in a national platform. I was one of the speakers at the CPAC conference several months ago. I used that platform among that conservative national audience to talk about freedom of religion in our nation, and where are we as a conservative movement as well. Are we narrowing our view of what that means, or are we leaving this open for all faiths and of any faiths? And my challenge to the group at CPAC was stay aware that you have a freedom to exercise your religion just like that person has a freedom to exercise their religion. And we cannot shut this down, because 70% of the country identifies themselves as under a Christian religion doesn't mean that we inhibit people of other faiths to live theirs. So we are to be open, and we are to be that beacon where the rest of the world can see how we can live side by side. We haven't been perfect at that, but we've got to be able to push back against that, and at every spot. And where we get it wrong, it's our responsibility to be able to speak out and try to push our own constituencies and our own people to be able to help get that right again. It's part of leadership.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have to wrap up now. It has been so wonderful to have the senators here and hear your voice. Thank you so much. And if you could, please sign up. There's a sign-up sheet outside where you can write down your name and your email address. Thank you again for coming.